Assalamu alaikum students and greetings to all of you. This is Hira Raees and today we are going to start very first and the basic topic cost classification related to fundamentals of management accounting. Before we start, I would like to discuss about the importance of this topic because cost classification is like the vocabulary of management accounting. We are dealing with the vocabulary and we are using these words in these terms throughout our entire course. So it's very necessary for students to relate the definition with the term. Like for example, if I am dealing with the prime cost in chapter number 5 or chapter number 6, they must know what we are talking about. So those students who have a previous accounting background must have been through this topic and must have a proper understanding of this, like students who are coming from the background of MA1 and MA2. But those who have their paper exempted, this might be the first platform where we are dealing with management accounting concepts. So first of all, we will discuss about cost classification. Foremost thing is the element of cost. Students, please make up your mind that cost in all the organizations remains the same. It's not a universally accepted concept that if certain organization is bearing a certain category of cost, then the other organization would be bearing the same too. For example, if I am dealing with my activities from a building and that building is on rented space, so I have to pay rent expense to the landowner. But for example, if I own that building, in that case, my trial balance doesn't show the rent expense. So point to say is, cost I will be listing over here, it's not necessary that all the organization will bear same type of cost. There are a variety in it. So that's the basic reason that in management accounting, we don't go with certain type of presentation that every organization has to prepare their management accounts in the same format. Formats will differ according to their need, according to their criteria. For example, expenses in a manufacturing organization are entirely different than expenses in a service sector. We are not using material over here, but they are using material in order to produce a manufacture a product. So when we talk about the elements of cost, there are three elements of cost. One is material. Any expenses you incurred on buying certain non-living thing, it's material. Material can be in any form, it can be in solid form, it can be in liquid form, it can be in gas format as well. For example, if I am buying petrol for my generator, so that petrol is obviously material, I am buying a thing. So don't think about whether it's in solid or in liquid. If it's a thing, then it's come under the category of material. Second element of cost is if you are paying to your employees. When we are talking about labor over here, we are not talking about blue collar workers or white collar workers. We are generally talking about the employees of the organization, whether they are security guard, whether they are teachers, whether they are manufacturers, whether they are machine technician, whether they are quality engineers. Any staff, any employee, we will come under the head of labor. Either we are paying them their basic salaries or bonuses or holiday pay or sick pay or allowances or traveling allowances as well. So these all come under the heading of labor cost. So the other expense is a very broad category. If any expense is not material and if any expense is not human as well, then that expense will come under the head of other expenses. For example, if I am paying for the electricity bill of the organization, then electricity bill is not a material. After paying the expense, I am not buying anything. Electricity bill is not labor also, so it come under the head of other expenses. Likewise, depreciation expense. Those who don't know about depreciation, it's basically related to non-current assets. So the depreciation expense is not a material, it's not a labor. It come under the head of other expenses. Interest expense. Interest is not a material, it's not a labor also. It also come under the head of other expenses. So other expenses is a very broader category. If you think that the expense is neither a material nor a labor, then obviously it would become under the head of other expenses. Now students, let's check our concept first before proceeding further. I am presenting you certain categories of cost in front of you. We have to first categorize them as material or labor or other expenses. For example, if I'm talking about factory supervisor, then supervisor is a worker, he's a labor. So it's obviously a labor. paper used in office. Paper is a non-living thing, it's a thing. So if I'm buying paper to be used for printers or other administrative tasks, obviously it's material. Electricity bill is neither a material nor a labor, it's other expense. Likewise, depreciation is not a material, not a labor too, it's also come under the head of other expenses. Security guard of factory. So security guard is basically a worker, it's an employee of an organization, so it's a labor. One thing I would like to clear over here, for example, if when I was dealing this in my classroom, a student asked that if I am buying petrol for my generator, then it's using on a thing. It's not about where you are using it. It's basically about what you are paying for. You are paying for petrol. So likewise, if I am paying salary of a machine operator, then machine operator is operating a thing. It doesn't matter what he's operating, what you are paying for, it's for a salary, it's for labor. So it come under the head of labor. Insurance of office equipment, it is not material because insurance is something. Likewise, few students claim that we are insuring an asset is a thing. It's not about you are insuring what, it's about what you are paying for. You are paying for insurance expense, and after paying, you are not getting any human services or you are not getting anything. So it's other expense as well. Rent of admin office, rent expense is again other expense. It's not a material, it's not a labor. So first we have to decide whether the particular expense is belong to which element of cost. I don't or never claim that organizations bear all types of expenses. For example, we are running an institute over here. We are not manufacturing any product. So except for papers and markers we don't use any particular or material or in large quantity. But yes, our labor cost is high. We have to pay our teachers, we have to pay our admin staff. So my point to say is that we cannot label that every organization have certain expenses including material, including labor. It varies from organization to organization. Now, when we are talking about cost classification, we know that we have got three elements of cost: material, labor, and other expense. When we are talking about cost classification, we classify our cost into two broader categories. One is prime cost. Prime cost includes direct material. Yes, it includes direct labor. It includes direct expense as well. In other words, when we accumulate all the direct costs, the sum of all direct costs is prime cost. We will deal with each of them individually in order to understand what is direct material or direct labor or direct expense. But one thing you have to remember is when we accumulate or when we add up all the direct cost, we get our prime cost. Prime cost, another name for direct cost as well. Secondly, we classify our cost in overheads. Overheads, we also call overheads or named overhead as indirect expenses. It includes indirect material, indirect labor, and indirect expenses as well. Now, it's very important for our students at this stage to distinguish between direct material and indirect material. It's very important for them to extinguish between direct labor and indirect labor also. So we will deal with in particular all of them, and then we will move and apply those concepts over certain illustrations. Let's talk about direct or indirect labor. So before dealing with direct and indirect labor, you must know the nature of the organization, what activities it is involved in. Because it might be possible that a direct worker for one organization might be an indirect worker for another organization. Let's suppose I'm talking about a rider who deliver food from the restaurant to the desired customers. Now, if I'm talking about the salary of that rider, whether that direct worker or indirect worker, if my business is to run a restaurant, the person who is manufacturing that product, who is cooking our burgers or our chicken, that chef is a direct worker because our task is to getting things done, not to getting it delivered, right? So for the restaurant, their chefs are direct worker, but their riders are indirect workers because few customers have opted to dine in, few customers have opted to take away, few customers have opted for delivery at their homes. Whatever their option of getting our products, but the person who is engaged in the manufacturing of that product is a direct worker for the restaurants. They are chefs as well. But the one who is delivering it to their desired destinations are an indirect worker, because our first task is not to getting things delivered, but to get it cooked. But our business is like Food Panda, where we charged customers just for deliver. We are not manufacturing burgers or pizzas or any continental dishes, but we are charging our customers for the delivery. Our organization is related to the transportation of goods. Then in that case, the rider is a direct worker for them. So the thing is, likewise, if I have a transportation business in which I deliver goods from point A to point B, driver would be a direct worker for me, because he is the one who is directly involved in the operations which I am dealing with. But if I am a biscuit manufacturing firm or any juice factory I have, and after once it is done, I delivered it to various retail outlets, and I have got a driver on my payroll too. In this case, driver is an indirect worker, because my task is to produce that biscuit. My operations are related to the production or manufacturing of biscuits and juices rather than getting it delivered. So then in this case, driver would be an indirect worker. So if someone asks you to tell them about whether that particular employee is direct or indirect, you must have asked that what your organization is destined to do. Likewise, in hospitals, why do you go to hospitals? To get your treatment, and doctors are treating you, direct workers, because they are directly engaged in that business. But if I'm talking about a certain sports team which is going on a foreign tour, and we know that on foreign tours there is a medical staff also attached to them which look after them in case of any injury. So in that case, the salary of doctor is an indirect cost. He's an indirect labor, because the main task is not to provide the medical services. It's about our main players are direct workers basically, but now the doctor is an indirect worker. So my point to say is, if you have to distinguish between direct labor and indirect labor, you must know the task, the operations of the organizations. I would also like to add one more example. For example, if I'm running an institute over here and I have hired a carpenter and I have ordered him to manufacture 500 desks and tables, desk and chairs for my students, then the salary of that carpenter, the wages I'm paying for that carpenter is an indirect cost, because my basic task is not to manufacture. I'm not a furniture business. I don't have furniture business. But for an organization who is involved in a construction industry, who is constructing or building houses for their customers, for them, not even carpenter, but the electrician, plumber, painters, all those who are involved in designing the house and building the house are all direct workers. So for me, carpenter is an indirect worker because I am running an institute over here. And for others, carpenter is a direct worker because they are involved in the construction of houses. So point to say is, we cannot label a certain staff that this is always direct worker and these are always indirect workers. We must know the nature of organization before deciding or claiming whether the particular employee is direct or whether the particular employee is indirect. Same concept would be applied on direct material and indirect material as well. If I am giving you example of a material, for example, if I am saying that I am using wood, tell me whether it's direct or indirect. You cannot tell me because you don't know what task I'm involved in, right? Like I am working in a university and I have to build up certain furniture for office and classrooms. In that case, wood I am buying is indirect material because my objective or my organization does not involve in buying and selling of furniture. But if, for example, if I have a paper factory, so paper factory raw material they use is wood. For them, wood is a direct material because that wood would be used in that finished good which I am selling to customers. Likewise, if I am running a restaurant and we are buying ingredients to make our food done, we are buying chicken, we are buying oil, they are all direct material. But if I have a textile factory and besides textile factory, I have cafeteria also where my workers go and eat and have their lunch. So they are also using chicken and oil, they are also cooking food over there, but my factory is textile factory. So all these material is indirect. It is not directly, it's not directly have been used in manufacturing of my thread which I am manufacturing. So in this case, that ingredient I am using in my cafeteria is an indirect material, right? So it's the concept applies for direct labor and direct material both. You must know the nature of organization before claiming it as direct or indirect one. If I'm saying you that I am a car manufacturer, so what would be my direct material? So yes, all the material that have been used in designing the car, that is its steel body, that is glass used for its windows, side mirrors, back mirrors, everything, fabric used for seat covers, tires, these are all direct materials because you are using it in manufacturing of car. But if you are buying lubricants for machinery in which your car has been manufactured, so that lubricant is indirect material because that lubricant would be used in machinery and that machinery would manufacture your car. So that would be an indirect relationship. I'm not saying that there is no relationship exists between lubricants and cars. There is a relationship, but it's not a direct one. For example, if I am going to buy lubricants, I have to ask my production manager how many hours you want to run this machine. Because if he's saying that I have to manufacture 300 cars, then I must know, I would not be knowing that how much lubricant you require. Yes, if he tells me that I have to run this machinery for 300 hours, so I must have an idea that how much oil I would be needed, yeah, how much greasing oil would be required in successfully running 300 hours of that machine. So point to say is, first you must know, the examiner will obviously tell you that our objective or our organization is dealing with this product. Now tell me that which of the following amongst A, B, C, D are direct or indirect. So students, this was direct material and direct labor. Now prime cost also include third element, which is direct expense after direct material and direct labor. The most easiest example to remember is the material which we use to build up the product is direct. The labor which is indirectly involved in the manufacturing of the product is direct labor. As far as direct expenses are concerned, there are few expenses which are not material, not labor, but they are directly incurred when you are manufacturing a unit. For example, sometimes we use other firm's formula or design or name or trademark while manufacturing our product. So we have to pay royalty to that firm. Royalty is something you pay for the copyright registered formula when you're using those things in your product as well. So if the question is stating that every unit we manufactured, we have to pay royalty of $2 to certain organization, then that $2 is a direct expense because every time you produce, it's not a material. You are not paying for the thing. You are not paying for the labor. It's something that's other than material and it's other than labor. But still, when you are manufacturing it, you have to bear this expense. So this is direct expense. One thing you should be kept in mind that if the question states that we have to pay royalty for every unit sold, then this is not a direct cost because you are not paying for the manufacturing, you are paying for the selling expense. So the expense that is outside the factory cannot be direct one, right? When we are talking about direct, it must incurred for the manufacturing of that product, not for its selling, not for its storing, not for any other thing, right? So sometimes it also happens that there might be some customer requirement. For example, let's suppose I produce t-shirts, white t-shirts, which is very famous, and I have a brand of producing white t-shirts. Now a customer approached me that kindly stitched 200 t-shirts in which there is a logo of our institute over there. Now, do you think that to print a logo on white t-shirts, would it cost me additional, whether it's $2, whether it's $3, but it would cost me additional pounds to do that. That additional cost, because I'm bearing that additional cost because on the request of customer, that is the direct expense, and that additional cost will be directly chargeable to that customer, not all the customers, right? Whether it's for 2 pounds or 3 pounds. This might also be the situation that your customer approached and he wants his order to get done by 15 days and it's a peak season and my all workers are engaged and I have working at full capacity. So he has offered me to get it done and asked me that please ask your labor to work overtime and I will pay the additional expense. Now, in order to motivate your workers to do overtime, you have to pay extra. But because this overtime is on the request of customer, then that overtime cost would be directly chargeable to that customer. Because obviously, if you are working overtime because on the request of customer, on that overtime period, you must be working on the manufacturing of that customer's order. So that cost would be directly chargeable to those units which you are manufacturing for your customer. So if you are incurring any extra expenses because of the special request of customer, then that expense would be direct expense. So in the question, if you ever read that I have done this expense on the request of customer, must forgot that whether this is direct labor or indirect labor, you just charge this expense to direct expense. One more example I would like to quote. For example, if my customer has convinced me, okay, I'll ask my workers to do overtime and manufacture your product in 15 days. What do you think? If my workers are sitting after 6 o'clock, don't we need a security guard? Don't we need a factory supervisor? We do need indirect labor also. Like direct laborers are not the only ones who, yes, they are involved in the manufacture of product, but we want a team. Okay, so it's not about many of our students might claim that direct labor are the important workers or indirect labor are the least important ones. It is not the situation. I would like to quote certain example which is relevant for you. For example, when you are watching this video, you are paying for the lecture and I am delivering the lecture. So I am the direct worker over here. But you must have contact the admin to buy these lectures. So we cannot say that they are irrelevant staff over here. Only I am important, only I am relevant. So direct and indirect cost has nothing to do with who is important, who is least important, who is educated, who is not educated, who is getting more salary or who is getting less salary. It's about the work you are doing, right? So as far as overheads are concerned, we have dealt with indirect material, I have dealt with indirect labor as well. Anything which is not fitting in any category, it comes under indirect expenses. For example, if it's not a thing, if it's not a human expense, if it is not on customer request or directly chargeable to the products, then all such expenses are indirect expenses, right? For example, rent, for example, insurance, for example, all the utility bills. Like for example, if I am paying for electricity bill, I will never have electricity because customer has asked me to do so. It's my general requirement, that's why I have to pay this expense. So it's not a material, it's not a labor, and it's not on customer request or anything directly chargeable to product. It comes under the head of indirect expense. So indirect expenses is a very broader category. It includes all. So students, a point to remember is then when we accumulate all the costs, it's direct cost, it's prime cost, and when we accumulate all the indirect costs, these are overheads. Our classification is not done yet, but it's very important at this stage that you must do practice, and there are questions in kits as well, and we will provide you also the working material so that you would be able to distinguish between both of them. So let's proceed further. Here are just few examples so that we would be able to distinguish. For example, I am dealing with the first table over here. Medicine used in hospital. So in hospital, the medicines have been used. It's a direct cost, obviously. Chicken and oil used in restaurant. It's a direct material as well. Oil used in university cafeteria. Now it's an indirect cost. Okay, because the main task of university is not to buy and sell oil. Cotton used in textile factory. Yes, cotton is a raw material in this case. We buy cotton and then we manufacture a thread. It is the basic operation that textile industries do. So the cotton used in textile factory, yes, it is direct. Oil used to lubricate machinery. I'm talking about machinery which is manufacturing the product, but oil is not directly used in the manufacturing of that product. It is used in the machinery which manufactured the product. So there is an indirect link involved between both of them. Medicine used in foreign tour of a sports team, it's an indirect cost. because in that case direct material would be bat, ball, gloves, material you are using. Stationery use in office, obviously it's also indirect cost. Likewise for the labor table as well. Security guard of college, it's an indirect labor cost. But for example, if I have got a, yes, the B point clears it all. Security guard employed by security company, yes, it's a direct cost because our organization is to provide security guard. They are our direct workers. Canteen chef in a rubber factory, it's an indirect cost, obviously. Carpenter in construction firm, it's a direct cost. Medical staff in textile factory. Yes, we do have medical staff in factories as well to deal with any injuries or to give first aid to our employees. We have got medical staff in school and colleges too. So it's an indirect cost. Driver in transportation business, it's a direct cost because we are transporting goods. So the person who is involved in this transportation task is a direct worker. Likewise, when we are using Careem and Uber, their drivers are the direct workers for them, because they are earning with them. Factory supervisor is never involved in manufacturing of the product. He just supervise, he just monitor, he just involved in the smooth flow of operation, but he himself not engaged in the manufacturing of the product, so he's an indirect worker. Now students, let's move further. Second thing in this classification is to distinguish between production or non-production overheads. We have been through prime cost. Prime cost is direct material, direct labor, and direct expense. One thing I would like to clear at this stage is whenever you read prime cost in any question, in any illustration, there won't be word mentioned production prime cost, because prime cost is always related to production. We don't need to mention it, right? For example, prime cost include direct material. Direct material is the material that is used in production. Prime cost includes direct labor. Direct labor is the one who is involved in manufacturing of the product. So prime cost is always production cost. There is no second thought in it. But as far as overheads are concerned, overheads are those costs which are not directly incurred on the manufacturing of a product, but it's still there. We classify overheads into further two categories. There might be production overhead and there might be non-production overheads as well. Let's deal with the slides first. Yes. Now, in an organization, we have got number of departments. There is a factory, there is a production area, but there are other departments as well. For example, accounts, for example, IT, for example, HR, for example, sales department. There isn't any one organization, one department in an organization. As the size of organization increases, the expansion, we need more departments for the smooth flow of operations. So we have got factory, and in factory we incur two type of cost. Prime cost always been there, because prime cost is direct material, direct labor, and direct expense. And there is also one more expenses which called production overhead. These are expenses that are incurred in the factory but not in manufacturing of the product. They are overheads. For example, if I am talking about factory supervisor, so the supervisor is not involved in manufacturing of product. He is not a direct labor, he is an indirect labor. Indirect cost means he is an overhead. But because we are incurring this overhead in factory, so this is a production overhead. Likewise, if I have hired a security guard for factory, that security guard is not manufacturing the product, so he is not prime cost. Yes, he is an indirect cost, he is an overhead, but because he is serving to a factory, it's a production overhead. But if that security guard is securing our accounts department, is securing our sales department, for them, in this case, it's a non-production overhead. So all those expenses that are outside the factory are non-production overhead. Outside, for me, outside means is that they are not directly serving to the factory. Many students might claim that the factory security guard is also outside the factory. So it's not about that. It's about to whom you are serving. If we have got a cafeteria outside factory who only engage in giving lunch or food items to factory workers, then it's a production overhead. It's not used in the product we manufactured, but still we are serving to the factory department. we are here to serve factory department, then that cost is a production overhead. All expenses that has been incurred on the department that is outside the factory, whether they are any department, account, sales, marketing, HR, admin, IT, they are non-production overhead, right? So if I ask you about certain expense and you have said to me that it's a prime cost, it's end of question, end of answer, full stop. But if you claim that this expense is an overhead, you have to specify it whether that overhead is production overhead or whether that overhead is non-production overhead. I would like to first check out this. There are a few expenses I have mentioned over here, and it's a table in which if it's a prime cost, you have to mark it A. If it's a production overhead, you have to mark it B. If it's a non-production overhead, you have to mark it C. My suggestion is, whenever you see a certain expense or you observe this expense, you first have to think in your mind whether this expense is direct or whether this expense is indirect. In order to be that expense to be direct, it must fall under three heads, whether it's direct material, whether it's direct labor, or whether it's direct expense. If it falls under any of each category, any of these three categories, it would be labeled as prime cost. And if it's not a direct material, if it's not a direct labor, if it's not a direct expense, then it must be an overhead. Now, if you claim that this expense is an overhead, you have to specify whether that overhead is factory overhead or whether it is outside factory. I mean to say whether it's a production overhead or whether it is a non-production overhead. So let's start with electricity bill of factory. So electricity bill, for me, it's not a direct material. For me, it's not a direct labor. For me, it's not direct expense as well, because we are not paying electricity for one unit, right? We are paying electricity as a whole. Even when we are not manufacturing any product, we have to pay electricity bill because there is a fixed line rent attached to it. So it means that electricity expense is not directly related to number of units I have produced, right? If I am taking a class and I have to switch on 6 lights and I have to switch on 2 air conditions in order for that class to go smoothly. Now, if there are 30 students over there, still I have to switch on these lights. If there are 28, if there are 25, if there are 20, if there are 15 students, I have to build up an environment of a class. I have to bear this electricity expense. Doesn't matter how many students I have in the classroom. So point to say is, electricity bill is indirectly related to number of students. It's not directly related to operations I do. So electricity bill is an indirect cost. Yes, it is. Now, if it's an indirect cost, now the question arises whether it's a production overhead or a non-production overhead. Answer to it is, it's a production overhead. It is so because we have incurred this electricity bill in factory. So it's a production. If we have incurred this electricity bill in sales office or in admin office, then it would be a non-production overhead. Number B, security guard of accounts office. Security guard is obviously a labor. Now I'm thinking whether it's a direct labor or indirect labor. It's not a direct labor because they are not involved in manufacturing of a product. So he's not a direct worker. So it's still there, it's overhead. Now the question arises whether it's a production overhead or non-production, because in this it's clearly mentioned that it's a security guard of accounts office, it's a non-production overhead, right students? Now number C, wheat used in biscuit manufacturing firm. So yes, it's a direct material because wheat would be directly used in the manufacturing of that product which I am destined to sell. Overtime worked in factory on request of customer. As I have told earlier that if there is a request involved, if there is a customer request involved, then that expense would come under the head of prime cost. It would be a direct expense as well. Petrol used in sales vehicle. No doubt petrol is a material cost. Now I am thinking whether it's direct or whether it's indirect. So petrol is not used in the manufacturing of a product. It cannot be a direct material. It's pretty sure that it's an indirect material. Now, if it's an indirect material, it's an overhead, but is it a production overhead or non-production overhead? Yes, students, it's a non-production overhead because we have bought this petrol for a sales vehicle. If we have bought this petrol for the generator used by factory, then that petrol would be a production overhead. But now in this situation, it's a non-production overhead. Rent of admin office. Rent is not direct material, rent is not direct labor, rent is not direct expense, rent is not prime cost at all. We have confidence over here that rent is an overhead. Now the question arises whether this rent is production overhead or non-production overhead. So the answer is, because it's incurred in admin office, yes, it's a non-production overhead. My suggestion to you is just pause video over here or in start if you got the concept, and try to just find out the answers yourself, and then compare it with my solution as well, so that you must know that whether you have got the clear understanding of this concept or not. Okay students, now there is G and H. I would deal with it simultaneously. Carriage inwards is the cost you incurred for buying the raw material in, and carriage outward is the cost you incurred for selling your finished good, right? So whatever cost you incur to get raw material into your premises is your production cost, right? Whether you are storing that raw material in the warehouse, that warehouse cost is also production overhead. My point to say is, whenever you got confused whether it's production or non-production, you must think like this, that all the expenses you incurred from buying the raw material till it's finally manufactured, all these expenses are production cost. Once it is manufactured, once it is packaged, now it's totally sales department concern what they do with it. So carriage inward is not direct material, is not direct labor, not direct expense, it's not prime cost, although it's overhead, but we call it production overhead. And carriage outward is a non-production overhead. So any expense that you have seen is related to raw material, it's production, and any expense you have seen for the selling of that finished goods, it's a non-production. Insurance is not direct material, it's not direct labor, it's not direct expense, so it's not prime cost, but yes, it's overhead because it's factory machines insurance, so it's a production overhead, student. First you have to check whether this particular expense is anywhere falling in the prime cost list. If it's not, then it's overhead as well. Mechanic in car repair shop, he's a direct worker because our task or our job is to get our car repaired, not ours but obviously for customers, and the person who is repairing it is a direct worker, it's a prime cost. Discount allowed to customers, it's a non-production overhead because it's something that have been dealt by our sales department team or accounts department. It has nothing to do with factory or the goods you have manufactured, so it's a non-production cost. Now, this is the last slide of this topic, and we just summarize what we have done in this whole topic. So first of all, we deal with direct cost, and direct cost is, this is a book definition, and when I'm telling this definition to students, it gives a very vague idea of what it's all about. We need further detailing in it. So direct costs are all costs that can be traced to a specific cost unit. One thing more, I would like to talk about cost unit. Cost unit, for example, if I am calculating the cost of this pen, then this pen is a cost unit. Cost unit is basically name of that product in relation to which you are calculating the cost. If I am calculating the cost of this laptop, then this laptop is a cost unit. If I am calculating cost of a glass, then the glass is a cost unit. The cost unit is our product in relation to which we are calculating our cost. Sum of all direct costs are prime cost, and sum of all indirect costs are overheads. Full production cost. Full production cost is another name for full factory cost. It is a sum of prime cost and production overhead. We have to accumulate all the factory costs, which includes factory direct cost and which includes factory indirect cost as well. So thank you so much, students. I hope that this concept will be clear to you all. My suggestion is you have got BPP revision kit and you have got Kaplan revision kit of FMA. After viewing this presentation, go to that questions and try to attempt it and apply all those concepts which we have discussed over here. Go through your textbook as well. As I've said in the very start, that it's very important that you must, we usually as an accountant claim that if you are sleeping and someone wake you up and then just ask whether this particular expense is direct or indirect, you must not think. Your answer should be sudden. That's how you clear your concept should be regarding this area. So thank you so much once again. Hopefully, we'll be back with another topic.